Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Jane, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Looking back, I think that this talk, like all of us, had two progenitors. One was the wonderful Federico Barocci exhibition at the National Gallery in London in 2013, and the other was the very different experience of working with the Adamson Collection over 3 years. This was a collection formed by Edward Adamson, a collection of paintings and drawings by patients in a mental hospital in Surrey between the 1940s and the 1980s, and Edward Adamson was their art therapist. Federico Barocci was a painter, not a British one, of course. He was Italian. He came from Urbino. In 1560, he went to Rome, where some of the local painters invited him out for a picnic, and Barocci believed that they poured a poisoned dressing on his salad, and as a result, he was seriously ill. He returned to Urbino and became a patient for the rest of his life, in the sense that he experienced ill health for the whole of his career, and his health affected the paintings that he produced, as was clear in the exhibition. The painting on the screen is his sympathetic portrayal of people who are sick, paralyzed, blind, or starving, or praying to the Virgin to intercede for them, as Barocci did himself. In a medical context, most of them might be called patients, as was Barocci. And the people in the mental hospital in Surrey who created the Adamson Collection could also be called patients, and they certainly produced paintings as well as drawings and works in other media. So if you throw in the seductive element of alliteration, you can see why the term paintings by patients came to the forefront of my mind. However, to continue the alliteration, it's a bit more problematic when you probe it. As I've just mentioned, patients who are seriously ill are less likely to be able to produce paintings, actual paintings in acrylic, oils, watercolor, or gouache, than drawings in pencil or crayons or biro. And if the word paintings is inappropriate, what about the term patients? In my work with the Adamson Collection, I discovered that in some elements of the psychiatric world, the term patients is deprecated and now sounds old-fashioned and patronizing. The people who attend the clinics or live permanently in secure accommodation are regarded as people with lived experience, the experience which is inside their heads, which is always present to them, but can be elusive to the doctors and paramedics who are trying to help them. These psychiatrists may be ahead of the game here, as NHS websites are full of references to patients, inpatients, outpatients, patient care, and so on. And outside the world of psychiatry, there are other people who would once have been called patients, but it would be surprising and possibly offensive to call them that today. I'm thinking of people living with certain natural conditions, such as the limbless painters Matthias Buchinger in the early Georgian period in England, or Sarah Biffin of Liverpool in the reigns of George IV and William IV, and their foreign counterparts such as Louis Ducornet, shown on the right. In recent years, works by all three of them have changed hands for large sums, but it would be absurd to describe them as just as patients rather than as artists. So both the term paintings and the term patients are questionable. And please bear that in mind when I use either of those terms inappropriately as a kind of shorthand for more diverse elements, people who are not defined as patients, and works of art that are not limited to paintings. And I'm certainly not implying that there is anything at all surprising about works of art being produced by the people that I'll be talking about. After that disclaimer, I'm going to discuss five English artists who experienced illness in some way And the first one is Luke Clennell, not a famous name today, but well known particularly in Newcastle upon Tyne, where the Lang Art Gallery has a good collection of his work. He was well known as an engraver and watercolor artist, but in 1814, he had the good fortune to receive a commission for an oil painting. And this commission was from John Egerton, 7th Earl of Bridgewater. The commission was to paint a very large painting of a banquet held by the City of London to commemorate, somewhat prematurely, what they thought was the defeat of Napoleon, that was before his escape from Elba. To quote from one biographical source, the painting was to contain the portraits of more than 100 of the guests. Sketches had to be made of them, accommodating all their foibles and vanities as sitters. And as you can see, they included the Prince Regent, the Emperor of Russia, and the King of Prussia. In 1817, when this had been accomplished by Clennell and the composition established, a depression seems to have descended on him. He became more and more dejected. Eventually, Clennell turned the picture to the wall and refused to discuss it. He was shortly afterwards, at 36, committed to a London asylum. The incomplete picture of the 1814 banquet was later finished by other hands and is now, after a long period of misattribution, restored to Clennell's name in the Guildhall of London. By 1827, Clennell was living with relatives in Northumberland. He'd gone back to north from London. But before his uncontrolled insanity led to his incarceration in a Newcastle asylum. He died on the 9th of February, 1840. So his mental illness lasted in various forms for some 25 years. However, there is nothing in the painting that might suggest that it was the composition of a mentally ill person. So we should not necessarily assume or expect a painting by a patient to be recognizably different from one by a healthy person. Turning to an artist with physical illness, this painting by William Henry Hunt is a superb example of his work in watercolor belonging to Leamington Spa Art Gallery. Hunt's skill in representing the moisture and textures of organic forms in nature, the glistening light and the mingling of colors is almost unbelievable and accounts for his fame in his lifetime and today. He's famous, as you can see, those on top of the screen, there is a blue plaque on his house near my office in London in Marchmont Street, which I often walk past. And there he's actually called on the plaque William Henry (brackets) Bird's Nest Hunt. But again, a biographical history of the Watercolor Society says that he was sickly and lame from childhood. He was regarded as too weak to follow his father's profession, which was as a tin plate worker and japanner, making decorative metalware and cardboard and cash boxes. And J.L. Roget wrote a history of the Watercolor Society, records a remark made by one of Hunt's uncles that his nephew, little Billy Hunt, was always, in the language of the day, a poor cripple, and as he was fit for nothing, they made an artist of him. One can see why a man of impaired mobility, who was just 5 feet tall and with an ungainly appearance described as grotesque, should devote himself to minutely detailed paintings in watercolor rather than become a portrait painter in oils. And that if he had been fully fit, his career would probably have taken a different turn and maybe a less successful one. My third example is Victorian painter John Magnold Burgess, who was well known for his Spanish scenes, the result of several visits to Spain. One of his Spanish pictures is on the screen, showing an old war hero leaving church and receiving the respects of some local civilians. He was the son of an artist and the grandson of an artist and the great-grandson of an artist. and was the nephew of two artists. His distinguished artistic family background led the Magazine of Art to write, "He is a congenital talent, and he may be cited as a living argument in proof of the theory of heredity." Well, one of the things that he inherited along with his artistic talent was a valvular disease of the heart, probably the once common disease called rheumatic heart disease, which afflicted him from childhood onwards and caused him concern, particularly in connection with his marriage in 1860, when he told his proposed father-in-law that on account of his heart disease, he was unable to obtain life insurance for his widow. Despite that, he did live to the age of 68 before dying as a result of his heart condition, and was able to leave his family a substantial sum, but that was thanks to his churning out innumerable half-length Spanish señoritas who were very popular, but as you can see, the two on the screen are in public collections. But there are many more than this, and they're very repetitive, which perhaps accounts for the fact that although he was a prolific painter, he's not a well-known name today and is not regarded as having been a successful or important figure in history of art. A similar case, but not true of the lack of Burgess's lack of success and fame today, is the painter Atkinson Grimshaw. Once seen, his paintings are instantly recognizable. North of England townscapes, in the twilight, usually in autumn, sort of this time of year, populated by trudging human beings, seen only in silhouette, and making their way down the long road of life. They are marvelously atmospheric. I think this is a particularly good one in Russell Coates' art gallery in Bournemouth, which is well worth a visit for anyone who hasn't been there, for its marvelous collection. Here is one by Atkinson Grimshaw of Liverpool, in which he uses one of his favorite effects, the glowing light of shop windows reflected off the rainy streets and pavements. And the reason why his paintings are so easily recognizable is that they are also quite repetitious. So if you look at the next, compare this one of Liverpool with the next one of Leeds, one can see that he has sort of translated all the Liverpool motifs into a big street in Leeds. And one of the reasons why he was obliged to repeat himself was that he had tuberculosis, and like Burgess, needed to sell as many paintings as possible in his lifetime in order to provide for his family. But as he had a patron who wanted to buy as many paintings as he could paint, and they are still much admired today, he had no need at all to change his practice. But in the case of Burgess and Grimshaw, one can see how their physical illness affected their output. Moving into the 20th century, Louis Wain was a brilliant painter of cats performing human activities, but the mental illness which had been known in his family also affected him. And after he had attempted to wrestle with a wardrobe that he thought was attacking him, he was admitted to a public asylum in Tooting in South London. There he carried on painting and drawing in his usual style. And one day when he was drawing a cat in the asylum, he was seen by one of the visitors to the asylum, who was a bookseller called Dan Ryder. Ryder said to him, "Good Lord, man, you draw just like Louis Wain." And Wain replied, "I am Louis Wain." And this turned out to be no delusion. So that led Ryder to try to raise funds for Wain to be transferred to Bethlehem Hospital, and he died in Knapsbury Hospital in Hertfordshire in 1939. In his lifetime, Wain was famous for kind of paintings shown in the example on the left, of cats performing a song and dance routine, but he also painted more abstract paintings of cats, such as the one on the right, which were included in an exhibition entitled Aspects of Schizophrenic Art, which was put on at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London in 1955. It included several of these abstract paintings by Louis Wain, with interpretations by an eminent psychiatrist, G.M. Carstairs. It was really Carstairs who popularized the idea, originally put forward in 1939 by the psychiatrist Walter Maclay, the idea that Louis Wain's abstract paintings of cats, called kaleidoscopic paintings, showed signs of a mental breakdown. In other words, that when Wain saw a cat, he saw the kind of image shown on the right of the screen. However, that view is not generally accepted today. The painting on the right, for example, is inscribed Early Greek. It is one of several paintings by Wain depicting cats in various styles, which are found in such style books as Owen Jones's The Grammar of Ornament of 1856. Both of Wain's parents were in the textiles business, and his mother was a designer of carpets and embroidery, and so she must surely have been familiar with books such as The Grammar of Ornament. But this one on the screen is particularly interesting because in Owen Jones's day, 1856, there was no early Greek style. The Greek style for Owen Jones had no chronological subdivisions. So Arthur Evans had not yet carried out his excavations in Knossos in Crete, which occurred between 1900 and 1910. So if Wain was painting his cat in the swirling motifs found in these Cretan discoveries, now called Minoan art, he must have found out about them through the news media while he was in an asylum. Now, this does not sound like the behavior of a man who sees cats as if they were in a kaleidoscope. In this, on this screen, the second pot from the right has got some of those swirling shapes, as have various others in the picture. For those interested in the story of Louis Wain, there's a wonderful collection of 55 works by him in the Bethlehem Museum of the Mind in Beckenham. And there was the premiere last week of a new film, The Electrical Life of Louis Wain, in which Benedict Cumberbatch plays the title role. It will be released by Amazon on the 5th of November. I do hope it includes the Dan Ryder episode and does not contain too many historical absurdities. At the beginning of this talk, I briefly mentioned the Adamson Collection, and I want to return to it now in a bit more detail. It is a sub-collection within the Wellcome Collection, but it contains several thousand paintings and drawings, of which just over 2,000 are recorded in the Wellcome's online catalogue. The collection was formed by an art therapist called Edward Adamson, 1911 to 1996. He's shown there on the right, characteristically wearing a bow tie. Between 1946 and 1981, Adamson ran an art studio within Nevern Mental Hospital in Surrey. Nevern, which is shown on the left, was a campus of attractive red brick buildings with a social centre and a chapel, superbly situated on a hill with panoramic views of the Surrey countryside. It's still there, but transformed into luxury housing, with the former chapel now containing a swimming pool and gym. In Nevern Hospital, Adamson gave the long stay residents an occasional opportunity to cease being patients and to become artists for a few hours a week in a dedicated studio and gallery. Adamson held different views from many other people who were involved in art therapy at the time. Firstly, although he was an art teacher, he did not try to make people paint or draw in a particular style or manner. In other words, he was not at all prescriptive. And secondly, he did not use the resulting paintings for diagnostic purposes, which was the intention of some of the psychiatrists at Nevern when they agreed to employ him at the hospital. For Adamson, the making of the pictures was intended to be therapeutic in its own right. The Adamson Collection at the Wellcome Collection consists entirely of paintings by residents of Nevern. Patients, if we want to use that term, and the majority of the paintings and drawings are annotated by Adamson with information about the painting and the artist. As a result of Adamson's non-prescriptiveness, his artists could adopt whatever approach appealed to them. Some looked back to their childhood or to the time before they entered the institution, as in this painting from 1949, in which the artist looks back to the Victorian Christmases of their childhood. Many of the paintings in the collection by amateurs or outsider artists are similar in style to some work by professionals whose work they had certainly never seen. For instance, some of them could be mistaken for works by Jackson Pollock or Cy Toomley, and in this case, paintings by Helen Bradley, a very well-known painter. But Bradley's pictures did not start to be exhibited until the 1960s, which was long after the paintings by H. Sennett in the Adamson Collection were painted. Others took advantage of the freedom of the art studio to vent their criticism of the asylum itself, the asylum in which they were detained by force of law. In the picture on the left, the artist portrays herself as being lashed by the sadistic man in a white coat, while the right-hand painting by Joan Wisdom shows a patient in terror of inhuman treatment by psychiatry, institutionalized human being, terrorized patient, possibly referring to the fact that electroconvulsive therapy was still used at Nevern in Adamson's time. During their sessions in the art studio, the artists could get their anger out of their heads and express it on paper, but Adamson had no wish to prevent them from doing so. In fact, that was one of the purposes of having them in the studio in the first place. Others ponder metaphysical conundrums, such as the meaning of life. On the left, Helen Gregg compares her adult self to her fetus in the womb, surrounded by an incomprehensible, swirling world. While on the right, another patient, Janet Bryce, views life as a long, futile trek up to the top of a cliff under the sun. But after all our efforts, all we can do is fall off it to our deaths. Others used their time in the studio as an opportunity to enjoy bright colors in their often drab life, or the sheer pleasure of making patterns, as in these paintings by Mary Bishop. But they are rarely just patterns, they're rarely just patterns. In the left painting, the brown motif is used in other paintings by the same artist to represent a pair of hands in supplication. And the red crisscross motif on the right represents the Battle of the Somme, which had played some part in her parents' life. And the same artist, Mary Bishop, leaves no doubt about the anguish of her mental state in her many paintings of a head frightened or weeping or screaming, sometimes with an external source of pain, as shown in the left painting, and sometimes with no source shown, but portraying anguish inside her head as a condition of her existence. And sometimes the artist comments on Edward Adamson himself, who obviously played a large part in their lives. He was probably the person whom they met most frequently, who was not either a doctor or a paramedic. The artist of the drawing on the left, Martin Birch, had some idea of the funding and administrative problems which Adamson faced, as there were sometimes doubts in the minds of the administrators and the doctors as to whether the hospital should be funding art therapy at all. A recognizable portrait of Adamson with his bow tie is headed by the words, "Mr. A moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform," expressing appreciation of his ability to keep the art therapy studio going. And on the right, a painting called "A Night on the Tiles" shows a fantasy of one resident at the hospital that she and Edward Adamson were about to elope from Nevern and enjoy a rapturous honeymoon in Paris. When I showed this painting to a group of trainee art therapists, the tutor commented that it was not unusual for a patient to become infatuated with a therapist, that this was something that she would devote a separate class to. The last, or actually last but one artist I'm going to mention is Brian Charnley. He lived in Bedfordshire and studied at Leicester School of Art, but suffered a series of schizophrenic episodes, possibly triggered by use of the drug LSD and exacerbated by bad luck in his life and made worse by the side effects of the antipsychotic drug chlorpromazine and also by electroconvulsive therapy, which still existed in his lifetime. He was hospitalized, but sadly took his own life in 1991. In the last weeks and days of his life, he painted a series of self-portraits and kept a dream diary at the same time. And the self-portraits show the same themes that appear in his dream diary, so the one can be used to comment on the other. He described his paintings as a way of coming to terms with his illness, which to some extent amounts to an inversion of reality. And there you can see his description of my schizophrenia. Forces seem to be acting, vibrations come from outside. He's hearing voices, and his sense of his self has crumbled away. This is the first, on the left, this is the first of a series of, I think, 14 self-portraits. And this one he describes as a conventional one. It looks like, it seems a good likeness to me. He could have made a living as a portrait painter had he lived. But things are very different by the time we reach the 9th self-portrait of 18th of May of 1991. And he says in his diary, "From the 10th of May, I had cut down to one antidepressant and so was not sleeping much. My mind seemed to be thought broadcasting very severely. It was beyond my will to do anything about it. I summed this up by painting my brain as an enormous mouth acting independently of me." And you can see the tongue lolling out of his brain and out of control, and his actual mouth nailed down and bleeding. And here is the 13th self-portrait from 13th of June, 1991. "The eggs have been emptied like a head stripped of its contents. It has nothing left to it, no more secrets. They went to satisfy somebody's appetite, somebody that has power over me. Needless to say, I feel suicidal, so I painted in Van Gogh's crows," that's the black creatures on the right, from his final suicide picture of the wheat field. ESP, there's the paranormal again, horns, voices as mouths grinning, and those two are shown on the right. Birds come from eggs, so the crows can be like my thoughts flying away. All this sort of gossip increases my fears of telepathy. And again, he emphasizes his suicidal feelings. And this is the last of his self-portraits. So it's 6 days after the previous one of the eggs, and it's exactly 1 month before he took his own life. And he's aware that there is no barrier between what is in his mind and what is outside. The outside has got its foot in the door of his mind. The things that are coming into his mind from outside are rebarbative, and he is unable to resist them. That was his last self-portrait before he killed himself. His paintings had served a purpose in his life, but they had not saved him from self-destruction. But they survive for us as the instructive record of a life with chronic schizophrenia viewed from the inside. Rather than end with suicidal thoughts, as I started this talk with Federico Barocci, I will bookend it with another Italian painter, Jacopo Pontormo, who also kept a diary like Brian Charnley. And in his diary, Pontormo describes his various illnesses on 48 separate occasions: diarrhea, nausea, headache, falling over and damaging his shoulder, dizziness, a cold, hard phlegm, and one I've put in the bottom left of the screen. Thursday morning, my head is spinning and it lasts all day, so that I am in every way in a bad state and weak-headed. Pontormo's travails are reminders that even renowned painters are but human and surmount them through their art with the aid of those whom Pontormo has depicted on the right: the doctors, the paramedics, the institutions, the family, and the carers to whom we all still look for help today.